January 1945. Somewhere on a frozen road in Belgium, engines idle in the dark, not tanks, not artillery. Trucks. Thousands of them. Their headlights are dimmed to slits, their drivers wrapped in wool and exhaustion. Fuel drums rattle, crates of ammunition creak with every bump. The road stretches endlessly west, back toward ports the Germans once believed were irrelevant. German officers had planned for steel. They had planned for speed. They had planned for shock.
What they had not planned for was this: an army that never stopped moving. An army that replaced losses overnight. An army whose strength did not come from brilliance at the front, but from order, discipline, and relentless supply far behind it. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German armor sits silent, not destroyed, but starving. No fuel, no spare parts, no shells. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht is not being beaten by tactics or courage. It is being outrun, and to understand how that happened, we must step back to a time when German generals believed logistics would never decide a war. In the decades before the Second World War, the German army built its identity around movement, speed, initiative, decisive action. The experience of the First World War had left a deep scar: endless trench warfare, attrition without progress, victory measured in meters rather than breakthroughs. German officers vowed never to fight that kind of war again.
Out of that determination came a doctrine later labeled Blitzkrieg. It was not a single written theory, but a culture. Fast-moving armored formations would punch through enemy lines. Infantry would follow. Air power would suppress resistance. The enemy's command structure would collapse before it could react. And for a time it worked. Poland in 1939 fell in weeks. France in 1940 collapsed in just over a month. The Low Countries were overrun with shocking speed.
German columns advanced faster than opposing headquarters could even locate them. To observers across Europe, it appeared revolutionary. What mattered less in those victories was what followed behind the front. German logistics were built for short campaigns. Railways carried supplies to forward depots. From there, horse-drawn wagons and limited numbers of trucks moved fuel, ammunition, and food forward.
The system was efficient, but only over relatively short distances, and only for limited durations. German planners assumed wars would be decided quickly. If speed broke the enemy, sustainment would never become a problem. That assumption hardened into belief. By 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at the height of its confidence. When Operation Barbarossa began, nearly 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. It was the largest invasion in history.
Once again, the opening week seemed to confirm German thinking. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken, but the distances were unlike anything Germany had faced before. Roads dissolved into mud. Rail gauges differed from German standards. Fuel consumption skyrocketed. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. Horses died in the tens of thousands. Supply columns stretched thinner with every kilometer east. German generals noted the strain, but they did not redefine the problem. They saw logistics as a difficulty to be endured, not a decisive factor to be mastered. When winter arrived, the illusion shattered. German formations stalled not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could no longer be supplied. Ammunition ran low, food froze in transport. Fuel shortages immobilized armor. The Red Army, backed by deeper reserves and shorter supply lines, recovered.
Still, even after Barbarossa failed to deliver victory, the lesson was only partially learned. Germany remained an industrial power, but it was not structured for prolonged global war. Its economy was fragmented across competing agencies. Production priorities shifted constantly. The armed forces often fought one another for resources. Strategic coordination between industry and the front remained weak. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht continued to rely on captured equipment and improvised supply solutions. Trucks came from dozens of manufacturers. Spare parts were inconsistent. Maintenance became a nightmare as the war dragged on. Soldiers were viewed as inexperienced, their commanders untested, their society seen as too comfortable for prolonged war. What German intelligence failed to measure was not American courage, but American organization. Because while Germany focused on winning battles quickly, the United States was preparing to fight forever if necessary.
And that preparation would soon transform logistics from a supporting function into a weapon in its own right, a shift that would only become visible once America moved from preparation to mobilization. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 forced the United States into a war it had been preparing for quietly but deliberately. What followed was not just mobilization but transformation. American leaders understood that victory would not depend on a single campaign or a single front. It would depend on endurance. The ability to move men and material across oceans, sustain them indefinitely, and replace losses faster than any enemy could inflict them. Within weeks, factories were retooled at unprecedented speed. Automobile plants shifted to producing tanks and trucks. Shipyards expanded around the clock. New ports were constructed. Old rail networks were modernized. Production schedules were standardized and synchronized with military planning. This was not improvisation.
It was systemization. The U.S. Army Service Forces, created in 1942, centralized logistics under one command. Procurement, transportation, construction, and supply were coordinated on a scale never attempted before. Every rifle, ration, boot, and vehicle was accounted for long before a soldier ever saw combat. Perhaps most importantly, American logistics were designed to operate globally. Equipment was standardized so that parts were interchangeable across units and theaters. Trucks used the same tires. Engines shared components. Fuel types were simplified. Maintenance manuals were uniform. Where the Wehrmacht relied on diversity and adaptation, the U.S. military relied on predictability. By 1943, American shipyards were producing Liberty and Victory ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. Cargo crossed the Atlantic in a constant flow. Losses at sea were absorbed without disrupting supply schedules. Ports in Britain expanded to receive this flood. Docks, warehouses, fuel depots rising almost overnight. British planners noticed the change first. American formations arrived not just with weapons, but with everything required to sustain themselves. Field kitchens, medical units, engineers, repair crews, entire logistical ecosystems landed alongside combat troops. The German High Command underestimated this buildup. Reconnaissance focused on troop numbers and equipment types. What it failed to grasp was volume. American strength was cumulative. Every month that passed made the Allied position stronger, regardless of battlefield outcomes. When Allied forces landed in North Africa in late 1942, the pattern became visible. Supply lines stretched from American factories to African ports, then forward into desert terrain. The distances were immense, yet American units remained supplied. By the time of the Italian campaign, logistics dictated tempo. Offensives paused not for lack of will, but until sufficient material was staged. When attacks resumed, they did so with overwhelming support. This approach was alien to German operational culture. The Wehrmacht prized initiative at the front. American doctrine accepted patience behind it. In Britain, preparations for a cross-channel invasion accelerated. Vast depots were constructed across southern England. Fuel pipelines were laid underground. Vehicles were waterproofed. Ammunition was stockpiled in quantities that dwarfed earlier campaigns. Operation Overlord was not just a landing plan. It was a logistical equation. Every division committed required precise daily tonnage of supplies. Every mile advanced would increase demand. American planners calculated this in advance and prepared accordingly. German intelligence detected the buildup, but misread its implications. The assumption remained that supply bottlenecks would cripple the Allies once they moved inland. Ports would be destroyed, roads would be choked, advances would stall. That assumption would soon be tested. Because when American forces finally broke out of Normandy, they did not pause. They accelerated. And behind them rolled something the Wehrmacht could no longer counter, a logistics system that turned distance into advantage rather than weakness. And it was from this collision of philosophies, speed versus sustainment, that the true contest began to reveal itself. In the winter of 1944, American soldiers moving through France were not just advancing armies, they were living proof of a system built to endure. Each man carried enough personal equipment to survive minor delays, but behind him waited a chain of support that extended thousands of miles. Truck convoys, field kitchens, and mobile repair units moved in coordinated waves, ensuring that exhaustion never became decisive. The contrast with the German soldier was stark. On the same road network, German infantry often waited for rations that never arrived. Horses pulled wagons through mud and snow. Mechanized units stopped for lack of fuel. Exhaustion, hunger, and exposure became as lethal as enemy fire. While German units huddled in frozen foxholes, American soldiers had hot meals, clean socks, and rotating leave schedules. The difference was not just physical, it was psychological. Morale soared when men knew that supplies, reinforcements, and medical care would arrive on time. Fear was mitigated, confidence reinforced. The human factor in logistics was invisible to most battlefield observers. Commanders on both sides focused on tanks destroyed or artillery fired. But for the individual soldier, the delivery of food, ammunition, and fuel determined whether he could fight, survive, and continue to advance.
In many ways, the war was not lost or won in the sky or on the battlefield, but in the kitchens, depots, and workshops that followed the American forces like a silent shadow. While German generals counted tanks and divisions, the Americans had begun measuring power in trucks, ships, and pipelines. The Red Ball Express, a supply artery that stretched hundreds of miles from Normandy ports into the heart of France, became a lifeline.
Thousands of trucks ran day and night, ferrying fuel, ammunition, and food to frontline units. Each truck represented more than steel. It represented mobility itself, a tangible weapon that could decide battles without firing a shot. Liberty ships, designed for mass production and rapid deployment, transformed ocean logistics. Even when U-boats sank hundreds of vessels, the pipeline never broke. American shipyards outpaced losses, maintaining a relentless flow of supplies.
Behind the front lines, fuel pipelines were laid across liberated territory, connecting ports to depots and bypassing the limitations of road transport. Mechanization replaced the vulnerabilities that horses and improvised wagons could not overcome. German planners, trained to anticipate tactical engagements, did not foresee the scale at which America could project logistical power. For every German tank halted by a fuel shortage, hundreds of American vehicles rolled forward without pause.
In this context, technology was not measured in the size of a gun or armor thickness, but in the efficiency and resilience of the supply chain. Each crate, drum, and mile of pipe became an instrument of war, invisibly shaping the battlefield. Tactics on the battlefield are traditionally judged by maneuver, firepower, and speed. But in 1944-45, logistics became the invisible force dictating operational tempo.
The Allies could sustain multi-divisional offensives because each unit, from infantry to armor, was continuously supplied. Breakouts were supported by predictable strings of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. American generals could plan attacks with confidence, knowing that logistical failure was unlikely. For the Germans, the situation was reversed. Blitzkrieg had succeeded when speed allowed for rapid seizure of objectives before supply lines became critical. But by late 1944, German spearheads routinely stalled. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks. Ammunition stockpiles ran dry. Units that should have exploited breakthroughs were forced to entrench, not because of enemy resistance, but because the logistical backbone had collapsed. Tactical brilliance could not overcome strategic scarcity. The battlefield became a mirror of the supply chain. Wherever American trucks rolled, soldiers advanced. Wherever German depots failed, progress halted. Logistical superiority effectively dictated the front line, turning maneuver into a reflection of supply rather than traditional combat. Battles were no longer won solely by tactics or courage. They were won by those who could sustain operations day after day, mile after mile across the vast European theater. Allied success in logistics was not just industrial, it was commanded with precision. General Dwight D.
Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, understood that supply was as critical as strategy. He coordinated not only armies, but also engineers, quartermasters, and transport planners across multiple nations. Every convoy, port expansion, and pipeline was planned weeks in advance. Contingencies were mapped meticulously, ensuring operations could continue despite enemy interference. German leadership, by contrast, remained focused on operational brilliance at the front. Commanders like von Rundstedt or Model emphasized troop movements and tactical improvisation, assuming supply would catch up. When shortages appeared, orders became desperate improvisations. Critical decisions like attempting counter-offensives in the Ardennes were executed with insufficient fuel and ammunition, turning what could have been bold maneuvers into disasters. Eisenhower's philosophy emphasized that logistical predictability created strategic flexibility.
The American High Command did not rely on heroism at the front. It relied on certainty in the rear. This difference in leadership mindset shaped every engagement. German generals could not outmaneuver the Americans when their own forces were immobilized by supply failures. The contrast was not in courage or skill, it was in the foresight to make logistics a core command principle. From the German side, intelligence repeatedly underestimated the Allied logistical machine. Reconnaissance reports focused on divisions, tanks, and artillery pieces, rarely assessing the supporting network that sustained them. Analysts assumed that the sheer size of American forces would be offset by operational inexperience and European supply challenges. The reality was starkly different. Every American soldier arriving in Europe was backed by a meticulously prepared network. German spies noted the flood of trucks, ships, and depots, but failed to grasp that this was not a temporary advantage. It was a system designed to accelerate over time. They expected bottlenecks that never appeared. Every failed prediction reinforced a dangerous complacency that the Wehrmacht could outfight the Americans if only they matched them on the front line. By the time of the Normandy breakout, German intelligence faced undeniable proof of failure.
Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements were arriving faster than the Wehrmacht could interdict. Counterattacks stalled not because of battlefield bravery, but because supply lines could not sustain them. The blind spot in German analysis, the inability to quantify and anticipate Allied logistics, proved decisive. They were fighting an enemy whose strength could not be measured in divisions alone. Logistics was not just material, it was moral.
Sustained supply gave Allied soldiers confidence that they could fight another day, recover from setbacks, and maintain offensive momentum. Soldiers knew their efforts were reinforced by a system that never faltered for long. In interviews and diaries, men frequently noted that consistent food, medical care, and equipment fostered resilience in the face of heavy combat. For the German soldier, the opposite was true.
When fuel ran out, artillery ammunition dwindled, or food arrived late, morale plummeted. Exhaustion became an invisible killer, slowing operations and sapping initiative. Armored units could sit idle for days, not due to enemy pressure, but because the nearest depot had run dry. In the Ardennes, entire formations froze in place, immobilized by logistical shortages.
Fear and frustration compounded physical suffering, creating a battlefield where even small tactical mistakes were amplified by systemic weakness. The moral dimension of logistics illustrates why material superiority alone was not enough for victory. Sustained, reliable supply nurtured confidence, endurance, and initiative. German generals had underestimated this intangible force, believing their soldiers' willpower could compensate for scarcity. By the winter of 1944, the consequences of that miscalculation were impossible to ignore. The summer of 1944 marked the beginning of a decisive confrontation in Europe. Operation Overlord had succeeded in securing a lodgment in Normandy, but the real test was whether Allied forces could sustain the advance across France.
From the beaches, American, British, and Canadian units began moving inland, confronting not just German resistance, but the vast complexity of supply chains stretching hundreds of miles back to the ports of Cherbourg and later Antwerp. The Red Ball Express was born from necessity. Thousands of trucks, driven mostly by African American soldiers, ran in convoys across shattered roads. Fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts flowed day and night.
Drivers braved shellfire, accidents, and exhaustion. Bridges were rebuilt, roadways repaired, and supply depots expanded on the fly. What the Wehrmacht had assumed would be slow attrition was, in fact, a relentless surge of material power. German armored units, meanwhile, faced crippling shortages. Panthers and Tigers required specific fuel and spare parts. Without them, they sat immobilized on roadsides waiting for deliveries that never came. In some sectors, units were forced to abandon tanks intact. Frontline commanders issued desperate calls for fuel, but supply lines were already consumed by Allied momentum. Blitzkrieg, once a symbol of German dominance, had run headlong into an invisible wall: endurance. Tactical brilliance could not compensate. The German doctrine of rapid counterattacks failed repeatedly, not because of Allied firepower alone, but because logistical support could not keep pace. Engineers rebuilt destroyed rail lines. Depots stored unprecedented volumes of ammunition, and mobile workshops repaired damaged vehicles in record time. Every obstacle that could have slowed the Allies was absorbed by preparation, adaptation, and sheer volume. American generals understood that the real weapon was movement, not merely soldiers on the front line, but the continuous flow of everything behind them. When divisions surged forward, fuel followed. When artillery pounded enemy positions, ammunition was already on its way. German intelligence observed this efficiency with growing alarm. The Wehrmacht could predict the attack, estimate the forces, even anticipate the routes, but it could not stop the tide of supplies that sustained it. The psychological impact was immediate. German commanders faced the terrifying realization that their most advanced formations were, in effect, stranded.
The Ardennes, the roads of northern France, even the approaches to the Seine became terrain not of combat, but of logistical failure. Decisions had to be made with the knowledge that any maneuver requiring fuel or repair risked immobilization. What had once been a tactical battlefield was now dominated by the arithmetic of supply. The climax was not a single battle, but a series of cascading failures. In July and August 1944, as American units pushed toward the Seine, German panzer divisions attempted to counterattack. Panthers and Tigers moved forward with daring, but their operational range was limited. Fuel shortages forced them to abandon objectives. Units that should have exploited openings were halted mid-advance. Engineers and maintenance crews were overwhelmed. The Americans, meanwhile, simply advanced with the predictable certainty of a well-oiled machine.
This confrontation highlighted the central truth. The war in Western Europe was no longer solely a contest of weapons, bravery, or maneuver. It was a war defined by supply. Each mile of advance tested the ability to maintain fuel, ammunition, and human endurance. German generals had underestimated this factor at every stage, and now the consequences were catastrophic.
As August progressed, American columns moved faster than German planners could react. Every immobilized tank and stalled truck magnified the gap between expectation and reality. The Red Ball Express, port expansions, and mobile maintenance units created a rhythm of relentless movement. Germany's finest units were trapped not by bullets, but by barrels of fuel that never arrived. By the time the Allies reached the scene and began to push toward Paris, it was clear logistics had outrun the Wehrmacht, reshaping the battlefield in real time. The next phase of this confrontation would test the very limits of German resistance and reveal how fully the American logistical machine could dictate the pace of war. By September 1944, the implications of Allied logistics were impossible to ignore.
After the liberation of Paris, American units pressed northeast toward Belgium and the German border. Roads were clogged with trucks, jeeps, and tanks, but the flow never stopped. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements arrived faster than German intelligence could calculate. The Americans had created a momentum that could not be countered with conventional force. Operation Market Garden, launched in mid-September, highlighted both the reach and limits of logistics. Airborne units captured bridges deep behind enemy lines, but the follow-on ground forces required enormous amounts of fuel and supplies to maintain the advance. German forces, aware of the plan, attempted to exploit weak points. Yet even as pockets of paratroopers became isolated, the American supply system worked tirelessly to mitigate losses, delivering what could be delivered and preparing reserves for what could not. Market Garden would ultimately fail tactically, but it underscored the scale and resilience of the American logistical network, a network that operated on a continental scale, coordinating land, sea, and air transport simultaneously. Meanwhile, German units faced the stark reality of attrition, compounded by shortages. In the Ardennes, preparations for the counteroffensive, what would become the Battle of the Bulge, were hampered by inadequate fuel and spare parts. Panzer divisions moved into position, but their operational range was limited. Tanks were often forced to wait for fuel trucks that could not traverse the congested roads. Ammunition stockpiles were inconsistent, and repair units struggled to maintain older, overused vehicles. German generals calculated risk under conditions dictated not by enemy fire but by logistical scarcity. When the Ardennes offensive began in December 1944, initial German advances shocked the Allies.
Yet even as armored formations penetrated deep into Allied lines, their success was measured in hours, not days. Fuel shortages slowed progress. Artillery units lacked sufficient shells. Vehicles abandoned by exhausted crews littered the roads. American logistical resilience turned what could have been a sustained breakthrough into a temporary crisis. Reinforcements, fuel, and medical support arrived at rates the Germans could not match, halting the offensive's momentum. The contrast between the two sides was stark. American units could fight and advance continuously, knowing that supplies would arrive regardless of obstacles. German units, brilliant in tactics and courage, were rendered static by the absence of material support. The battlefield became a mirror of logistical effectiveness, movement where supply existed, stagnation where it did not. By the close of 1944, it was evident that Germany's operational mobility had been permanently constrained by shortages, while the Allies' mobility was amplified by a system designed to endure and adapt. This turning point was not defined by a single engagement, but by the cumulative effect of continuous supply. Roads, trucks, pipelines, and depots had become weapons of war. The Germans had planned for blitz, shock, and rapid victories, but they had failed to anticipate a methodical, relentless, and infinitely patient logistical machine. What had been a theoretical advantage, industrial power, production capacity, and global reach now manifested on the battlefield in real time. By the time January 1945 arrived, the Wehrmacht faced a sobering reality. Units that had once formed spearheads were now defensive pockets, immobilized by lack of fuel and spare parts.
The Ardennes offensive had been the last gamble. Beyond it, Germany's ability to maneuver, supply, and sustain large-scale offensives was effectively over. The Americans, meanwhile, pressed forward with unbroken momentum. Their forces continuously reinforced and resupplied. The logistical rhythm they established dictated the tempo of the entire Western Front. The lesson was clear and inescapable. In modern war, the battle does not end at the front lines. It begins in factories, depots, and ports. The side that can sustain operations, replace losses, and maintain movement over time wields a power as decisive as any tank or artillery battery. The Wehrmacht had been outrun not in speed alone, but in endurance, scale, and systematic precision. And from this point, the aftermath of the collapse of German logistics would become visible, reshaping the final months of the European war and leaving an indelible mark on military history. By early 1945, the consequences of the Allied logistical superiority were unmistakable. German forces were no longer able to execute rapid maneuvers or sustain offensive operations. Panzer divisions, once symbols of blitzkrieg dominance, were stranded in the mud and snow of Belgium and northern France, immobilized by fuel shortages. Ammunition ran low in the artillery units, and repairs for tanks and trucks lagged behind the pace of losses.
In many sectors, German soldiers were forced into static defensive positions, not because they were outgunned, but because they were undersupplied. The human cost of these shortages was severe. German troops faced exposure to winter elements, dwindling rations, and the psychological toll of immobilization. Accounts from frontline units describe frustration as vehicles and guns were abandoned along roadsides.
Soldiers witnessed comrades suffer and die not in combat but due to logistical failures. The inability to maintain operational mobility eroded morale at every level. For the first time in the war, German generals recognized that their decisions could not overcome the grinding effect of inadequate supply. Meanwhile, the Americans and their allies advanced with unprecedented efficiency. Red Ball Express convoys continued to move without interruption. Mobile repair units restored vehicles within hours, often allowing tanks damaged in battle to return to the front line the same day. Field hospitals, fuel depots, and ammunition dumps kept pace with every advance. Even when roads were congested or targeted by German attacks, alternate routes and contingencies ensured continuity. The logistical system had become a weapon that operated independently of weather, terrain, or enemy action. Statistical evidence underscores the scale of the advantage. By late 1944, the Allies were landing more supplies in France each month than Germany could deploy on the eastern or western fronts. Over 12,000 trucks ran daily along the Red Ball Express alone, moving thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition. Liberty and Victory ships maintained an almost uninterrupted flow of cargo across the Atlantic, offsetting losses from U-boat attacks. In contrast, Germany struggled to maintain even basic fuel distribution for its frontline units. The strategic implications were immediate. Offensive operations, which had once relied on German initiative and surprise, now faltered. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last gamble to turn the tide, collapsed under its own logistical limitations. Panzer divisions ran out of fuel just miles from their objectives. Infantry units, lacking food and ammunition, could not hold captured ground. American and British forces, by contrast, could continue pressing forward without pause. The battlefield had shifted. The decisive factor was no longer firepower alone, but the ability to sustain it continuously. Beyond immediate combat, the psychological effect on German command was profound. Generals who had relied on tactical skill and operational daring now faced the harsh reality that their forces were increasingly prisoners of supply. Even brilliant maneuvers could be undone by empty fuel tanks or unserviceable artillery. Reports from the front began emphasizing shortages and attrition over tactical considerations. Strategic planning became reactive rather than proactive, constrained by what could actually be delivered to the front line. The collapse of German operational mobility also influenced Allied planning. With the knowledge that the enemy could no longer mount sustained counteroffensives, American commanders could exploit gaps, rotate units, and maintain continuous pressure. Cities, bridges, and supply hubs could be seized with the confidence that follow-on forces would arrive fully equipped. This systemic advantage allowed the Allies to maintain momentum, striking not only at the enemy's positions but at the very structure of German capability. As winter gave way to spring, the stage was set for the final months of the European war. Germany's ability to resist was no longer determined solely by its armies, but by the absence of the logistical resources required to wield them effectively. Meanwhile, the Allies demonstrated that victory could be orchestrated not just with strategy or courage, but with meticulous planning, industrial power, and unbroken supply. The lessons of 1944-45 would resonate far beyond the battlefield, redefining modern military doctrine and the understanding of what truly sustains an army in combat. As 1945 progressed, the consequences of Germany's logistical collapse became starkly visible across the Western Front. German units, once capable of executing bold counterattacks, were now largely immobile. Armored divisions lacked fuel to advance, artillery battalions ran low on shells, infantry units endured shortages of food, winter clothing, and medical supplies. Even elite formations could not escape the reality that their operational reach was sharply curtailed. The Wehrmacht had effectively been rendered a defensive army, reacting to Allied moves rather than shaping the battlefield. The Allies, in contrast, maintained a tempo of operations that seemed unstoppable. Supply lines stretched from the French ports deep into Germany, unbroken and resilient. The Red Ball Express and its successors delivered thousands of tons of material daily. Mobile repair units kept tanks and trucks operational, while fuel depots and pipeline networks ensured armored formations never stalled. This logistical superiority allowed for sustained pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously, forcing the Germans to disperse their already limited resources, further weakening their defensive capacity. Casualty and material figures underscore the imbalance. During the Ardennes offensive, German losses included over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, many abandoned due to fuel shortages. American units, though facing intense resistance, benefited from continuous resupply, enabling rapid replacement of personnel and equipment. By early 1945, the disparity in operational mobility meant that German units could no longer exploit any temporary advantage, no matter how skillful. Their tactics, supply, more than battlefield engagements, dictated the pace and outcome of operations. German generals recognized, often too late, the magnitude of their miscalculation. Post-war analyses and memoirs, such as those of General Model and Field Marshal von Rundstedt, frequently acknowledged that logistical inadequacy had been a decisive factor. While leadership, tactics, and courage remained important, they could not overcome systemic shortages. The German war effort had been undermined not by a single battle, but by an enemy capable of outproducing, outmoving, and outlasting them in material terms. Strategically, the Allied logistical model reshaped the final campaigns. Cities, railways, and depots captured by advancing troops could be immediately integrated into supply networks. Fuel pipelines extended deep into Germany, artillery shells were stockpiled in preparation for assaults, and reinforcements moved seamlessly to the front. The operational flexibility granted by these systems allowed commanders to plan offensives on a scale Germany could no longer threaten. What had begun as a support function moving supplies had become the decisive factor in the conduct of war. The lessons of 1944-45 were profound. The conflict demonstrated that industrial capacity, organization, and logistics could outweigh tactical brilliance or temporary battlefield victories. The German army, brilliant in strategy and courageous in execution, was undone not by inferior weapons but by the inability to sustain operations. The Allies, conversely, showed that meticulous planning and an unbroken supply chain could amplify combat effectiveness, allowing them to dictate the tempo and geography of the war. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into the heart of Germany, the Wehrmacht's fate was sealed. The collapse of German logistics made further organized resistance impossible. Armies became trapped, encircled, or disbanded as supplies evaporated. The American logistical advantage had transformed the European theater into a landscape where victory was no longer contingent on battlefield heroics alone, but on the invisible machinery of endurance, organization, and foresight. The final months of the war thus showcased a fundamental shift in modern warfare. Battles could be won not merely with weapons and strategy, but with supply. The logistical revolution that America had quietly perfected was now manifest on the battlefield, and Germany, for all its experience and tactical acumen, had been systematically outmaneuvered without a single shot in many sectors. The story of Germany's logistical collapse in 1944-45 is a reminder that war is won long before the first shot is fired. On the surface, the battlefield may appear dominated by tanks, guns, and soldiers, yet the true power often lies in the quiet, relentless machinery of supply. Roads, depots, pipelines, and trucks became weapons as decisive as any artillery barrage or armored thrust. The Americans demonstrated that endurance, organization, and foresight could shape the outcome of battles and, ultimately, the war itself. For the Wehrmacht, the lesson was both simple and devastating. No amount of tactical brilliance or battlefield courage could overcome the absence of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Generals who had once relied on speed and surprise found their formations immobilized by scarcity. The operational paralysis of late 1944 and early 1945 revealed the limits of a doctrine that underestimated the invisible dimensions of war. Blitzkrieg, once the symbol of unstoppable force, had collided with the reality that modern warfare required not only shock, but sustainment. Beyond immediate military outcomes, the events of this period reshaped strategic thinking for decades. Post-war, military planners worldwide studied the Red Ball Express, port logistics, and pipeline networks as examples of how organization could multiply combat power. Wars would no longer be fought purely on courage or firepower. Industrial capacity and logistical ingenuity became central to planning, execution, and victory. Yet there is a human element beneath the numbers and machinery. Soldiers, engineers, and drivers endured exhaustion, weather, and danger to keep the system moving. Their efforts turned supply chains into a living force, a silent army underpinning every advance. Victory was not merely delivered by generals or tanks, it was carried mile by mile, truck by truck, ration by ration. In the end, the collapse of German operations and the unstoppable advance of the Allies offer a profound truth. In modern war, endurance can be as decisive as speed, preparation as critical as valor, and logistics as lethal as any weapon. The war in Europe was won not only in battle but in the meticulous orchestration of human effort, material, and foresight, a lesson that echoes far beyond 1945 into every theater of modern conflict.